The autumn wind whistled through the cemetery's ancient oaks, their leaves dancing a somber waltz against the gray Massachusetts sky. Sarah Mitchell stood among the mourners, her black dress rippling in the breeze as she watched her father's polished mahogany coffin being lowered onto its stand. The familiar weight of Max's leash in her hand provided little comfort today. Her loyal German shepherd, usually the picture of calm, has been unusually agitated since they arrived at St. Michael's Church for the funeral service. The scent of rain-soaked earth mingled with the sharp sweetness of funeral flowers. Roses, lilies, and chrysanthemums arranged in elaborate displays that seemed to mock the solemnity of death with their vibrant colors. Sarah's throat tightened as she caught a whiff of her father's favorite cologne lingering on his suit jacket, which she'd carefully laid out just 3 days ago. Now, that same jacket clothed his lifeless body, and the familiar scent only intensified the crushing weight of his absence. Father Timothy's voice carried across the cemetery, his words barely registering in Sarah's grief-clouded mind. We gather here today to commit Thomas Mitchell, beloved father, respected judge, and pillar of our community, to his eternal rest. The priest's usually steady voice wavered slightly, drawing Sarah's attention. She noticed a fine sheen of sweat on his forehead, despite the cool October air, his fingers trembling as they gripped the prayer book. Max's sudden growl startled her from her observations. The dog's hackles were raised, his dark eyes fixed intently on the coffin. Sarah tugged gently on the leash, whispering, "Shh, Max, be good." But instead of settling down, Max's growl deepened, his powerful body tense with barely contained energy. A few mourners shifted uncomfortably, throwing disapproving glances in their direction. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but something about Max's behavior stirred a different kind of unease in her gut. In 15 years, she had never seen him act this way, especially not at a funeral, and they'd participated 3 in the past year alone, since Max was a certified therapy dog who often provided comfort at such events. "Why is that dog here?" A sharp whisper cuts through the air. This is highly inappropriate. Sarah recognized the voice. Judge Carlton, her father's colleague of 30 years. His wife, Margaret, clutched his arm. She expressed a mixture of disdain and forced sympathy. The Carltons had been fixtures in Sarah's life since childhood. Their daughter Amy, her best friend, until a mysterious falling out between the families 3 years ago. Her father had never explained what happened, and now he never would. Max's growl suddenly erupted into fierce barking, the sound echoing off the weathered headstones. Father Timothy stopped mid-prayer. His prayer book slipped from his trembling hands and landed with a dull thud on the wet grass. The priest's face had gone chalk white, his eyes wide with what Sarah could only describe as terror. "Perhaps," Father Timothy said, his voice cracking, "we should take a brief moment to—" He didn't finish the sentence, instead fumbling to retrieve his fallen book with shaking hands. "What's wrong with him?" someone whispered, and Sarah wasn't sure if they meant Max or the priest. The dog lunged forward, nearly pulling the leash from Sarah's grip. His barking had taken on a different quality now, not aggressive, but urgent, as if he were trying to warn them of something. Sarah had heard this bark only once before, the night he'd alerted her to a gas leak in her apartment building, potentially saving dozens of lives. "I'm so sorry," Sarah managed, her voice thick with tears and confusion. "Max, heels!" But even as she gave the command, a lifetime of training and discipline seemed to evaporate from her usually obedient companion. He strained toward the coffin, whining now between barks, his whole body trembling with urgency. Father Timothy had backed away from the coffin, his complexion ashen. "Perhaps we should... His words trailed off as he dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief, his other hand clutching his collar as if it were suddenly too tight. Sarah's trained eye, honed by years as a criminal defense attorney, caught the subtle details: the priest's averted gaze, the slight tremor in his left hand, the way he seemed to be fighting the urge to flee. These were told she'd learned to recognize in testimony who were hiding something, who knew more than they were willing to say. The sound of approaching sirens pierced the air, startling the assembled mourners. Sarah hadn't noticed anyone calling the police, but through the ornate cemetery gates, she could see 2 patrol cars approaching, their lights flashing against the granite headstones. "This is outrageous," Judge Carlton declared, stepping forward. "Sarah, control that animal or remove him immediately. Your father deserves better than this spectacle." The words stung, but they also awakened something in Sarah, a familiar spark of defiance that had served her well in courtrooms across the state. Max had never been wrong about danger, not once in all their years together. And Father Timothy's reaction, it was more than simple discomfort or annoyance. It was afraid. Sarah felt the rough texture of Max's leash cutting into her palm as she made her decision. The weight of all eyes upon her, judgmental, curious, concerned, pressed against her skin like a physical force. The scent of approaching rain hung heavy in the air, mixed with the cloying sweetness of funeral flowers and the earthier notes of turned fresh soil. "I apologize," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "But I need to ask, Father Timothy, is there something wrong? Something about my father's..." She couldn't bring herself to say body or death, but her meaning was clear. The priest's reaction was immediate and visceral. He staggered backward, crossing himself with trembling fingers. I can't. This isn't..." His face contorted with what looked like physical pain. The police officers were approaching now, their shoes crunching on the gravel path. Sarah, one of them, Officer Rivera, who had worked with her father on numerous cases. The other was younger, probably a rookie, his hand resting nervously on his belt. "Ms. Mitchell?" Officer Rivera called out. "We received an anonymous call about a disturbance." Before he could finish, Max gave another series of urgent barks, and this time Sarah thought she heard something else, a muffled sound coming from the direction of the coffin. The ambient noise of the cemetery seemed to fade away, leaving only the pounding of her heart and the blood rushing in her ears. Judge Carlton stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "This has gone far enough. Sarah, your grief is understood, but..." "Open it," Sarah interrupted, her voice barely a whisper at first, then gaining strength. "I want the coffin opened." A collective gasp rose from the mourners. Margaret Carlton pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Father Timothy swayed on his feet, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might faint. "That's impossible," the priest staggered. "The ceremony, the sanctity..." Officer Rivera was watching the scene with professional interest, his experienced eyes taking in the priest's distress and Max's continued agitation. "Ms. Mitchell, are you sure about this? Once we open a sealed coffin..." "My father," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady, "always told me to trust my instincts. And right now, every instinct I have is screaming that something is wrong. Max has never failed me, and he's trying to tell us something. Please." The next few moments seemed to stretch into eternity. The wind picked up, sending dead leaves skittering across the manicured cemetery lawn. Thunder rumbling in the distance, nature's percussion accompanied by the drama unfolding beneath the threatening sky. Officer Rivera exchanged glances with his partner, then nodded slowly. "Okay, we'll need to document this." He pulled out his phone and began recording as his partner stepped toward the coffin. "Stop!" Father Timothy's shout was almost a scream. "You can't! It's against—" But he fell silent as Officer Rivera turned the camera towards him. The younger officer reached for the coffin's lid, his hands hesitating for just a moment before finding the release mechanism. The sound of the seal breaking seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Max had stopped barking but remained rigid, his eyes fixed on the coffin. As the lid slowly opened, Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Her father's face was just as she remembered from the wake, peaceful and composed, but something was different. There, partially concealed by the elegant silk lining of the coffin, was a small digital recorder, its red light blinking steadily. Officer Rivera moved forward quickly, his trained eyes scanning the scene. "Nobody touches anything," he ordered, his voice sharp with authority. He reached into the coffin with a gloved hand and carefully extracted the recorder. Even before he pressed play, Sarah knew that her world was about to change forever. Her father's voice, strong and clear despite the slight digital distortion, filled with the funeral. "If you're hearing this, then something has gone wrong. I never made it to my natural death as planned. Sarah, honey, I'm sorry. What you're about to learn, I tried to protect you. The Carlton case wasn't what it seemed. The evidence in my safety? Father Timothy knows. God help me. He heard everything." The recording continued, but Sarah barely registered the words. She was watching Father Timothy, who had crumbled to his knees, his face buried in his hands. Judge Carlton stood frozen, his face a mask of fury and fear. And somewhere in the distance, the thunder grew louder. Nature's accompaniment to a truth that had refused to stay buried. Max pressed against her leg, his earlier agitation replaced by a steady, protective presence. Sarah reached down to scratch behind his ears, her fingers trembling as they sank into his thick fur. The dog had known. Somehow, he had known that her father's final message was waiting to be heard. The scent of rain was stronger now, the first heavy beginning drops to fall, creating dark spots on the polished surface of the coffin. Sarah felt each cold drop on her skin, like a reminder that she was alive, that this was real, that the comfortable illusions of her life were dissolving like sugar in the rain. Officer Rivera was already on his radio, calling for backup and a forensics team. The younger officer had moved to stand between Father Timothy and the cemetery gates, though the priest seemed to have lost any intention of fleeing. The mourners stood in shocked silence, testifying to the moment when a funeral became a crime scene. Sarah's legal mind was already racing, connecting dots she hadn't known existed. The Carlton case, a controversial acquittal 3 years ago that had driven a wedge between the families. Her father's increasing paranoia in recent months. The way he had insisted on updating his will, making her the executor of not just his estate, but also of a mysterious trust she hadn't known about until now. The rain was falling steadily now, but nobody moved. The truth, like the rain, was going to soak them all to the bone before this was over. Sarah felt a strange calm settling over her, the kind of clarity she usually only found in a courtroom when all the pieces of a case finally fell into place. Her father had left her more than just a recording. He had left her a mission, a truth that needed to be uncovered, a wrong that needed to be righted. And somehow, even in death, he had found a way to begin that process, with the help of a dog who understood that sometimes the most important evidence isn't what you can see or touch, but what you can feel in your very bones. The thunder crashed overhead, and Sarah Mitchell, daughter of Judge Thomas Mitchell, stood straight-backed in the rain, her hand resting on Max's solid presence beside her. The funeral was over, but something else was just beginning. And as she looked at the faces around her, some afraid, some angry, some confused, she made a silent promise to her father. The truth, whatever it was, would not stay buried. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of police interviews, hushed conversations, and sleepless nights. Sarah sat in her father's study, surrounded by the familiar scent of leather-bound law books and the lingering trace of his pipe tobacco, as she tried to make sense of the brewing storm. Max lay at her feet. His steady breathing provides a counterpoint to the chaos in her mind. The safe had yielded its secrets that very evening, a thick manila envelope containing documents, photographs, and a USB drive that made Officer Rivera's face grow increasingly grave as he reviewed its contents. "Ms. Mitchell," he had said, his voice carefully neutral, "we're going to need to involve the FBI on this one." Now, as the grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, Sarah pulled her father's old cardigan tighter around her shoulders and pressed play on the digital recorder for what felt like the 100th time. The sound of rain against the study's windows creates a melancholic backdrop to her father's voice. "The Carlton case wasn't simple corruption," Thomas Mitchell's recorded voice explained. "It went deeper than that. The trafficking ring had connections in places I never imagined. Law enforcement, judiciary, even the church. When I discovered Father Timothy's involvement, I knew I couldn't take this to the authorities without ironclad proof. They had already silenced 2 witnesses." Sarah's fingers brushed against the smooth surface of her coffee mug, now cold and forgotten. The taste of bitter coffee lingered on her tongue, mixed with the metallic tang of fear as she absorbed her father's words. Max raised his head suddenly, ears perked toward the study door, seconds before a soft knock broke the midnight silence. "Come in," Sarah called, her hand instinctively reaching for Max's collar. The door creaked open, another familiar sound that now seems ominous in the context of recent events, revealing Amy Carlton's tear-stained face. "I had to come," Amy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I heard what happened at the funeral..." "Sarah, there's something you need to know about the night your father came to our house 3 years ago." The air in the study seemed to grow thicker as Amy stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She looked different from the confident corporate lawyer Sarah remembered, thinner, more haunted, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of her own sleepless nights. The designer dress she seemed to hang loosely on her frame, as if she'd been slowly disappearing inside it. "That night," Amy continued, sinking into the leather armchair across from Sarah, "I overheard my father on the phone. He was scared, Sarah. I'd never heard him sound like that before. He kept saying something about the girls and how they needed to handle the situation before your father could file his report." The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway, marking the weight of each revelation. Sarah could smell Amy's familiar perfume, Chanel No. 5, unchanged since their college days. But there was something else, too. The sharp scent of fierce sweat that no amount of expensive fragrance could mask. "The next morning," Amy's voice cracked, "Dad told me that Judge Mitchell, your father, had agreed to recuse himself from the case due to a conflict of interests. But I saw the bruises on my father's knuckles at breakfast. He said he'd hit them on the car door, but..." Max growled softly, and both women started at the sound. Through the study's windows, Sarah caught a glimpse of movement in the garden. a shadow passing quickly beneath the security lights. Her pulse quickened as she reached for her phone, but before she could dial, the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. The sudden absence of the clock's ticking made the silence feel absolute. In that darkness, Sarah could hear everything with starting clarity. Amy's sharp intake of breath, Max's low growl, the whisper of movement outside the study's windows. The hair on the back of her neck stood up as she caught the distinct sound of the back door's lock being manipulated. "Get down!" Sarah whispered, pulling Amy behind her father's heavy desk. Max had positioned himself between them and the door, his muscular body tense and alert. The darkness felt thick enough to touch, carrying with it the musty smell of old books and the newer, sharper scent of adrenaline. The creak of floorboards in the hallway sent Sarah's heart racing. She could taste copper in her mouth, fear made manifest. Amy's breathing beside her was quick and shallow, her designer bracelet clicking softly against the desk as she trembled. The study door began to open. The hinges protested softly. In the darkness, Sarah could make out a figure, then two, their shapes black against the marginally lighter hallway. Max's growl deepened, but he held his position, waiting for Sarah's command. The beam of a flashlight cuts through the darkness, sweeping the room. Sarah held her breath, her father's last recorded words echoing in her mind. "Trust no one until you have all the pieces. The evidence in the safe is only the beginning. There's more hidden where we spent that last summer. You remember the place, honey. The cabin by the lake." The flashlight beam found the safe, now empty of its incriminating contents. A masculine voice cursed softly. "Check the desk," it ordered, and Sarah recognized the voice with a jolt of horror. Detective Phillips, her father's trusted friend of 20 years. At that moment, Max exploded into action. Sarah had never activated his protection training in a real situation, but the commands came to her automatically. "Max, protect!" The massive German Shepherd launches himself at the intruders with devastating precision. The flashlight went flying, spinning across the floor and casting wild shadows that transformed the study into a nightmare carousel of light and darkness. Sarah heard grunts of pain, the thud of bodies against furniture, and then the distinctive sound of a gun being drawn from its holster. "Sarah, tremble!" Amy's voice cuts through the chaos. But Sarah was already moving, her mind racing ahead to her father's words. The cabin by the lake. Of course. The summer after her mother died, when everything had fallen apart, and then, somehow, come back together. The cabin where she'd first met Max as a puppy, where her father had taught her that justice wasn't just about the law, but about truth and courage. The sound of breaking glass pierced the air as Sarah yanked Amy toward the study's hidden door, a remnant of the house's Underground Railroad history that her father had shown her years ago. Max's barking covered their escape as they slipped into the narrow passage behind the bookcase. The passage smelled of dust and age, the walls close enough to touch on both sides. Sarah led Amy by the hand, counting steps in her head, just as she had during childhood games. Behind them, she could hear shouting and confusion, then Max's bark growing more distant. He would find her. She knew. He always did. 20 steps to the turn, 30 more to the cellar door. Sarah's free hand traces the rough stone wall, her mind racing. The evidence in the safe had been damning enough. Photographs of missing girls, bank statements showing massive transfers through shell companies, transcripts of conversations that implicate judges, police officers, and clergy members in a trafficking operation that spanned the East Coast. But her father's words suggested there was more. something so significant that he had hidden it separately. Insurance against exactly this kind of situation. Something at the cabin that would blow the whole case wide open. They emerged into the cellar, the smell of earth and old wine barrels replacing the dusty confines of the passage. Sarah could hear rain drumming on the cellar doors above them, and beneath that, the faint sound of sirens in the distance. "Sarah," Amy gasped as they paused to catch their breath. "There's something else you need to know. The girls, the ones they trafficked. I think I know where they're keeping them. The church's summer camp property." Before she could finish, a familiar bark echoed from somewhere above them. Max had made it out and was signaling his position. Sarah squeezed Amy's hand in the darkness. "We need to get to the cabin," she whispered. "Whatever Dad hid there, it's the key to all of this. But first, we need to survive the night." The cellar doors creaked as Sarah pushed them open, letting in a rush of cold, rain-scented air. Above them, the night sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn, but the rain continued to fall, offering cover for their escape. Max appears beside them, his fur wet, but his eyes alert, ready to protect them whatever came next. As they crouched in the shelter of the cellar entrance, watching headlights sweep across the street as more vehicles arrived at the house, Sarah felt a strange sense of clarity. Her father had known this moment might come. He had left her a trail of breadcrumbs, knowing that she had the skills to follow them. Her legal training, her analytical mind, and most importantly, her unwavering determination to uncover the truth. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the rain. They would have to move soon. But for this brief moment, Sarah allowed herself to feel the full weight of what was happening. The cold rain on her skin, the trembling of Amy's hand in hers, the solid presence of Max beside her. These sensations anchored her to the reality of their situation. "Dad," she whispered into the pre-dawn darkness, "I promise you, this isn't over. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, the truth will come out." Max pressed against her leg, a low whine in his throat, his signal that they needed to move. Sarah squeezed Amy's hand once more, then straightened up. The cabin was 30 miles north, deep in the Berkshires, where cell service was spotty and the forests still held secrets. If they could make it there, if they could find what her father had hidden. The beam of a flashlight cut through the rain nearby. It was time to go. Sarah took one last breath, tasted the rain and the night air, feeling the pulse of justice and truth beating in her veins like a second heartbeat. Then, with Max leading the way, they slipped into the darkness, carrying with them the weight of secrets that had already cost one good man his life, and threatened to cost so much more before the truth finally came to light. The old Ford pickup truck groaned as Sarah guided it along the rain-slicked mountain roads, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn mist like dull knives. The vehicle had been her father's emergency backup, kept fueled and maintained in a rented garage 3 blocks from their house. Inside the glove compartment, they had found cash, a prepaid phone, and a handwritten note. "When the time comes, trust your instincts." Max sat alert in the back seat, his breath fogging the window as he kept watch. Beside Sarah, Amy huddled beneath a musty emergency blanket, her designer dress now stained with dirt from their escape through the cellar. The cab of the truck smelled of old leather, wet dog, and the metallic tang of fear that seemed to cling to their skin. "Your father," Amy said, breaking the tense silence. "He came to see me 6 months ago. I was too scared to tell you before, but..." She paused, swallowing hard. "He showed me pictures of the girls. Some of them couldn't have been more than 14. He said he had evidence that my father was just a middleman, that the real power behind the trafficking ring was... A pair of headlights appear in the rearview mirror, cutting through the darkness. Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel, its worn leather familiar under her fingers. "We've got company," she said, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. The segwaying vehicle was gaining ground. Its high beams flooded the truck's cab with harsh light. Max growled from the back seat, his hackles rising. The sound of the truck's engine seemed unexpectedly inadequate against the powerful purr of what was clearly a much newer vehicle. Sarah's mind raced through her options. The road ahead wound through dense forest, leading eventually to the turnoff for the cabin. But there was something else. A logging road her father had shown her years ago. Barely more than a trail, really. The truck's four-wheel drive had been one of her father's non-negotiable requirements for the vehicle. "Hold on," Sarah warned, just as their pursuer's engine roared with acceleration. She waited until the last possible moment, then yanked the wheel hard to the right. The truck lurched off the main road onto the nearly invisible logging trail, branches scraping against the windows like desperate fingers. The taste of copper filled Sarah's mouth as she fought to keep the truck steady on the rough terrain. Behind them, she heard the squeal of brakes as their pursuer overshot the turn. Amy's fingers were white-knuckled on the dashboard, she breathing quickly and shallowly. "There's something else," Amy gasped as they bounced along the trail. "The summer camp. It's not just a holding facility. They're using it for... She struggled to continue, her voice breaking. "They're conducting experiments, medical trials on the girls. That's where the real money comes from. Pharmaceutical companies paying for human trials that will never get approved through legal channels." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. The pieces were starting to fit together. The massive money transfers, the high-level protection, the involvement of medical professionals mentioned in her father's notes. The horror of it threatens to overwhelm her, but she forces herself to focus on the rutted trail ahead. The track grew narrower, tree branches whipping against the truck's sides. The smell of pine and wet earth filtered through the vents, mixed with the acrid scent of their fear. Max suddenly barked, a sharp warning sound, as headlights once again appeared behind them. "They know these roads," Amy whispered. "Of course they do. They've been using these back trails for years to transport." She couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah's mind flashed back to her father's voice on the recording. "The cabin by the lake. Remember where we used to watch the sunrise?" It hadn't made sense at first, but now... "Amy, reach under your seat. There should be a metal box." As Amy retrieved the box, Sarah guided the truck through a particularly treacherous section of trail. The box's rusty hinges protested as Amy opened it, revealing a set of topographical maps. The paper was old, cracked at the folds, but the markings were clear. And there, marked in her father's precise handwriting, was an alternate route to the cabin. "Left at the lightning-struck oak," Sarah murmured, reminding summers spent exploring these woods with her father. The ancient tree appears in their headlights, its split trunk a testament to nature's power. Sarah turned the wheel, taking them deeper into the forest. The new trail was barely visible, overgrown with years of disuse. Branches scraped against the truck's roof like fingernails on a chalkboard. The segwaying vehicle's headlights began to fade as the dense foliage swallowed them up. But just as Sarah began to relax, Max's ears pricked forward. Through the trees ahead, they could see flickering lights, flashlights, moving through the woods. They were being herded. "There's an old quarry ahead," Amy said, studying the map with shaking hands. "It's a dead end." The taste of fear was bitter in Sarah's mouth as she realized their situation. The truck's engine rumbles beneath them, a countdown to the moment of truth. The quarry ahead, pursuers behind, and somewhere in these woods, her father's final evidence. Evidence that could bring down not just a trafficking ring, but an entire network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of society. Then she remembered something else, a detail from one of her father's stories about his early days as a prosecutor. "The quarry wasn't always a dead end," she said, her voice tight with concentration. "There used to be a bridge across it to transport the stone. They dismantled it in the 80s, but the support pillars..." Understanding dawned in Amy's eyes. "Sarah, no, you can't be serious." But Sarah was already shifting the truck into a lower gear, feeling the engine's response through the vibrations in the steering wheel. The sound of pursuit was closing in from behind, flashlight beams dancing through the trees on either side. The quarry's edge was approaching, visible now through the thinning trees. Max pressed forward from the back seat, his solid warmth against Sarah's shoulder providing a moment of comfort. The smell of his fur, the leather seats, the damp woods, all of it burned into her memory as she made her decision. "Dad always said," Sarah spoke through clenched teeth, "sometimes you have to risk everything for the truth." The truck burst through the last line of trees onto the quarry's edge. In the headlights, Sarah could see the remains of the old bridge supporting jutting from the stone like broken teeth. The gap was wide, too wide, part of her mind screamed, but the angle was right. Physics and faith, her father would have said. Behind them, vehicles emerged from the woods. Flashlight beams caught them from both sides. There was no going back. Sarah's world narrowed to the sensation of the steering wheel in her hands, the roar of the engine as she pressed the accelerator to the floor, and the solid presence of Max beside her. Amy's gasp of terror mixed with the squeal of tires as they hit the edge of the quarry. For a moment, they were airborne. The truck's headlights illuminated nothing but empty air and the far edge of the quarry. Time seemed to stop, hanging suspended like the truck itself. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, feel every breath in her lungs. Then, reality crashes back in with the impact of the truck's front tires hitting the far edge. Metal screams as the undercarriage scraped against stone. The back wheels caught, and suddenly they were hurriedly forward again, away from the quarry's edge. In the rearview mirror, Sarah caught glimpses of flashlight beams waving in frustration on the other side of the gap. They had made it. The truck was damaged. She could hear something dragging underneath, but they were alive. The cabin was less than a mile away now. Whatever her father had hidden there, whatever truth he had died protecting, they were going to find it. Sarah could feel it in her bones, in the same way she could feel Max's steady presence beside her and Amy's trembling breath in the passenger seat. As they limped the damaged truck through the darkness toward their destination, Sarah remembered something else her father used to say. "The truth is like a dog with a bone. It won't stay buried forever." She changed at Max. His eyes reflected the dash lights and managed a grim smile. How fitting that it would be a dog, her loyal, brave, truth-seeking companion, who had started them down this path to justice. The cabin's silhouette appears ahead, a darker shadow against the lightening pre-dawn sky. Whatever they find inside will change everything. Sarah could feel it in the electric tension that filled the truck's cab, in the way Max's ears were pricked forward, in the trembling of Amy's hands as she clutched the map. The truth was waiting for them. And this time, no one will be able to bury it again. The cabin stood silent in the growing dawn, its weathered walls holding secrets like a confessional. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she fitted the key into the lock, the metal cold against her skin. The door's hinges creaked, a sound that transported her instantly to childhood summers, to lazy afternoons reading on the porch while her father worked on case files, to the last time they'd been here together just 3 months ago. The musty scent of disuse meets them as they stepped inside, along with the lingering traces of pine and old wood smoke. Max entered first, his nails clicking on the hardwood floors as he performed a quick sweep of the space. The cabin was small, just 2 rooms and a bathroom. But Sarah knew every inch of it was like a familiar story. "He was here recently," Sarah said, noticing subtle signs: a coffee cup in the sink, fresh firewood stacked by the hearth. The morning light filtering through dusty windows cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the worn furniture and simple decorations that had remained unchanged for decades. Amy stood in the doorway, hugging herself against the morning chill. "What exactly are we looking for?" Sarah's eyes were drawn to the stone fireplace, the heart of the cabin, where she and her father had spent countless evenings talking about justice, truth, and the complexities of right and wrong. Dad always said that the best place to hide something is where everyone can see it, but nobody looks. Max had moved to the fireplace, his nose working along the stones. Sarah knelt beside him, running her fingers over the rough surface. The stone was cool beneath her touch, except there. A slight warmth, barely noticeable, coming from behind one of the larger rocks near the floor. "Help me with this," Sarah said, her fingers finding the edges of the stone. Together, they managed to work it loose, revealing a small cavity behind it. The space holds a laptop, its surface dusty but modern. Definitely not something that has been there for years. Sarah's hands shook as she pulled it out. A post-it note was stuck to the top, her father's familiar handwriting stark against the yellow paper. "The password is the date you first met Max." The memory hit her with crystal clarity. July 15th, 2009. She had been devastated by her mother's death 3 months earlier, and her father had brought her to the cabin to escape the suffocating sympathy of well-wishers. The tiny German shepherd puppy had been waiting for them, a surprise that had finally broken through her grief. The laptop hummed to life. Its screen cast a blue glow in the dim cabin. Sarah typed in the date, and the desktop appeared, empty except for a single video file labeled Truth. Amy moved closer as Sarah clicked on the file. The video began playing, showing her father sitting in this very cabin. He looked tired but determined, his silver hair disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it, a habit Sarah had inherited. "Sarah," her father's voice filled the cabin, "if you're watching this, then what I feared has come to pass. The evidence you'll find on this laptop will blow the whole operation wide open. Names, dates, banks' records, and most importantly, videos of meetings where they discussed everything openly because they thought they were safe." He leaned closer to the camera, his eyes intense. "I installed recording devices in my office, in the church confession booth, and in Judge Carlton's study 3 years ago. What I captured, Sarah, it's not just trafficking. The pharmaceutical trials were just the beginning. They're using these girls as test subjects for experimental drugs, psychological techniques, even prototype neural implants. Companies are paying millions for human trial data that they could never get legally." The sound of a vehicle approaching made them all freeze. Max's ears perked up, but he didn't growl. A good sign. Moments later, they heard a familiar voice calling out, "Sarah, it's Rivera. I'm alone." Sarah opened the door to find the police officer looking exhausted but alert. "You're not going to believe this," she said, gesturing him inside. "But we've found it. All of it." As the video continued playing, Rivera's expression grew increasingly grim. The evidence was damning. Surveillance footage of meetings in Judge Carlton's study, conversations in Father Timothy's confession booth that had nothing to do with spiritual matters, detailed records of payments and shipments disguised as church youth program activities. The summer camp is just the beginning, Thomas Mitchell's voice continued from the laptop. They have facilities in 3 states, all operating under the cover of religious or charitable organizations. The ringleaders, you'll find all their names in the encrypted files, include 2 federal judges, a state senator, and a sudden crash of breaking glass shattered the moment. Max launched into action as a canister rolled across the floor, spewing thick smoke. Sarah heard Amy scream, felt Rivera pushed her toward the back door. The laptop. She couldn't leave the laptop. Through the thickening smoke, she saw shadowy figures entering through the broken window. The acrid smell burned her throat as she clutched the laptop to her chest. Max's barking seemed to come from everywhere at once, disorienting their attackers. FBI, everyone down! The shout cut through the chaos like a thunderbolt. More windows broke as figures in tactical gear swarmed into the cabin. Sarah felt someone pushed her down, covering her with their body as flashbangs exploded, filling the space with blinding light and deafening sound. When her vision cleared, Sarah saw Detective Phillips and 2 other men being handcuffed by FBI agents. Officer Rivera was speaking rapidly into a radio, calling for backup at the summer camp facility. Through the broken windows, she could hear helicopters approaching. "Sarah Mitchell?" A woman in an FBI jacket helped her up. "I'm Special Agent Monica Chen. We've been building this case for years, but we could never get enough evidence to move on the leadership. Your father's recordings. This is what we've been waiting for." The smoke was clearing now, being pulled out by the morning breeze. Max returned to Sarah's side, his fur dusty but his bearing proud. Amy was being checked by a medic, but she seemed unhurt. The laptop was safe in Agent Chen's hands, its precious evidence already being uploaded to secure servers. "There's something else you should know," Chen said, her voice softening. "Your father's death. It wasn't natural. We have evidence that Father Timothy administered a slow-acting poison during your father's last confession. But Judge Mitchell knew. He knew he was dying, and he used that time to prepare all of this. He chose the timing of his own death to protect you and ensure the evidence will come out when they were most vulnerable." Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes as the full weight of her father's sacrifice hit her. The morning sun was streaming through the broken windows now, catching the dust motes and smoke residue in its beams. She could smell pine needles, cordite from the flashbangs, and the familiar scent of Max's fur as he pressed against her leg. "The girls," she managed to ask, "at the camp?" "Teams are moving in now," Chen assured her. "They'll be safe. And with this evidence, we can shut down the entire network. Judge Mitchell's last case might just be his most important." In the days that followed, the story exploded across national news. Arrests were made at the highest levels of government, judiciary, and religious institutions. The pharmaceutical companies involved faced massive fines and criminal charges. Most importantly, hundreds of girls were rescued from facilities across 3 states, their testimonies adding to the mountain of evidence that would ensure justice was served. Sarah stood at her father's grave a week later. The autumn sun warmed the newly turned earth. Max sat beside her, as always, his presence a constant comfort. She placed a single rose on the headstone, its petals bright against the gray granite. "You were right, Dad," she whispered, the breeze carrying the scent of late roses and approaching winter. "The truth doesn't stay buried. Not when there are people brave enough to dig it up and loyal enough to carry it into the light." Max's tail thumped against the grass, and Sarah smiled through her tears. Her father had left her more than evidence. He had left her for a purpose. The law firm she was establishing would focus on human rights cases, working to expose corruption and protect the vulnerable. The truth, she had learned, was like Max, faithful, persistent, and ultimately unstoppable. As they walked away from the grave, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace beneath her lingering grief. The morning air was crisp with the promise of change, carrying the sense of autumn and renewal. Max trotted beside her, alert as ever, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The truth had cost her father his life, but his sacrifice had saved hundreds of others. And in the end, that was the greatest legacy he could have left. Not just the evidence that brought down the corruption, but the example he set of unwavering courage in the face of evil, and the unshakable belief that justice, though sometimes slow, was always worth fighting for. The sun climbed higher in the sky as Sarah and Max made their way home, their shadows stretching behind them like extensions of their shared purpose. The truth had been buried, but like all important things, it had found its way to the light. And now, with Max by her side and her father's example to guide her, Sarah was ready to ensure it stayed there, visible and undeniable, a beacon for all those still searching for justice in the darkness.